that's true. Naked Palpatine.
Oh, you pick that one. Fresh out of the clone tank, nude Palpatine is my
Well, that's the first thing I think of when you say Dark Empire Palpatine.
Hello everybody. I'm not feeling the best, but I need a weapon. And welcome back to the Halo Expanded Universe. And I have for you, as of right now, and whatever else I may have reviewed that came out in 2025, the last bit of Halo Expanded Universe content. I've now read everything. Not as much of a achievement as the Star Wars Expanded Universe, but still, I've read it all. Today I have for you Halo Epitaph by Kelly Gay. This is basically a journey through the afterlife. The didact is not back. At least not in the typical sense. And in a huge apology for Halo 5, I guess. A little bit more of an explanation, making it slightly more tolerable. I don't know what to say, non-spoiler wise. I've said this before about Kelly Gay when we dealt with Guilty Spark. What made the Forerunner trilogy work so well, it wasn't very character heavy. It certainly had character moments, but it was very much the grand scope of the story that was being told and the ideas. Character stuff was definitely the background. Kelly Gay seems to vastly have a firm handle on character. It's a very character-focused story. That being said, it takes what Grey Bear did and makes it very personal. Just like she did with Guilty Spark. And again, she does it phenomenally well. Exquisitely well. This is one of my favorite things I've read. I ended it with a high note. And I really don't want to say anything else. I know that it's like a year old now. 2 years old by the time that you're watching this. In 2025, but... or I guess a year old. Came out at the beginning of 2024. But still. It's a phenomenal read. And I highly, highly recommend it if you haven't. But I mainly want to get into spoilers now, talk about some stuff, so it has my seal of approval though. And with that, I have read everything. So I feel pretty proud of myself. It's a great story though. It is the didact in the domain, and a lot of stuff goes on. And it intertwines with Halo 5, Halo Infinite. And it gives some closure on some things, and I just think it's done amazingly, so read it. Read it. I'm getting spoilers now. If you don't want that, get out of here. Okay. The didact begins with no memory of who he is. But then we get a flashback to all of his children dying in the human Forerunner War. And he finally remembers who he is. We quickly get a recap of the Great Bear books. Very brief. But from the Ur didact's perspective. I say Ur didact because we also had, in the Forerunner trilogy of the Great Bear, if you haven't read it, we learned about a character named Born Stellar Makes Eternal Lasting. For short, Born Stellar. And he was a young manipular Forerunner who would later go on to become a copy through genetic mutation of the didact, and he would be dubbed the ISO didact. But this is the original didact that we met in Halo 4, the Ur didact. Offensive bias was meant to go against mendicant bias, is something we learned. We meet a character named Hyruspis. We also meet the Warden Eternal. We haven't heard that name since Halo 5. And he basically beats up the didact. It's pretty funny. We get some reuniting with the Confirmer. We met the Confirmer in one of the Forerunner trilogy books, but it was cool to see him again. We get a very, very, very slight mention of the Escalation comic. We basically tried to ignore that one and focus on everything else in this book. Cortana convinces the warden to work for her. We actually get to witness that, which was interesting. We also get more backstory for the Didact here. We learn that when he was a young child, his parents were rebels against the current regime, government of the Forerunners. And so they were meant to be burned alive, or not burned alive, but they were meant to be killed. And they were not meant to be buried or have any sort of, they were to be forgotten. And then the Didact was put into a chamber where he would have his memories erased, and he'd be raised as the warrior caste. He only now remembers. But they were executed for the rebellion. The Didact also was not always a Didact. His original name is Lost to Time because he got his memory erased. His parents named him something else, but after he got his memory erased, he was then dubbed Shadow of Sundered Stars. An adult named Silence tells the Didact, "Your parents are right. They are right about the problems with the government. But they don't have the powers to change. They didn't have the power to change anything. They're just shouting to the ether. If you want your opinion to carry weight, if you want to matter, then obtain power at all costs. Seek power for power's sake. If you have power, then you can make a change. People will actually listen to you, but only if you have power." And she reminds him that you are what you dare, which is a continued mantra of the Didact in the original Forerunner trilogy. You are what you dare. Cortana is in the domain, same as the Didact. It is basically essentially his soul. It is his mind, his data left inside this thing. And Cortana wants control of the domain because then she can control the Guardians that we see in Halo 5 and everything. But the Didact talks to her and she mocks him. We learn that the Guardians, the reason we didn't hear about them in Greg Bear's trilogy or in Halo 4, was that the Guardians were just meant to deal with lesser worlds and lesser problems. If something arose that was a big enough concern, they could just blow up the planet. But the Forerunners are meant to deal with even grander scale things. They didn't want to have to deal with the lower things, so they left it to the Guardians. Which is why we never heard about them, because they always hung out in the fringes. It was a nice retcon. The Didact is doing a lot of jumping around to the domain and doing other things in this afterlife, and he actually witnesses Cortana's speech at the end of Halo 5, to the humans and to all species, about submitting to her will. The Didact, again, is continually having these memories and these conversations throughout the story. He is, slightly, in little ways, being able to manipulate the events of current day. And so, when Locke, Exuberant Witness, are trying to save Master Chief from the Cryptum at the end of Halo 5, that, Cortana has them all in, the blue team in, it is Locke, Exuberant Witness, as we saw in the game, but also secretly the Didact that helped Blue Team escape the Cryptum. Another time, the Didact talks to Cortana. Cortana gets upset, so she forces him to relive a memory with the Gravemind. Because remember, before the Gravemind, he actually met the Primordial, which was basically also a Gravemind, which messed with his mind. And then, after that, he met the Gravemind while he was in the burn. Again, if you haven't read the Forerunner trilogy by Greg Bear, now this is going to make sense to you. But the burn is basically back during the time of that trilogy. There was an entire portion of the galaxy that was completely and utterly consumed by the flood. They called it the burn. It was, don't enter. But they had sent a Didact there. And so he had met the Gravemind. He had had a conversation. The Gravemind and him talk. The Gravemind wants to know where the Ark is. And, the Didact's not telling him. This also beautifully shows who the Didact truly is. Because, he becomes quite confrontational at the end of the third book. And it becomes more of what we see in Halo 4, but he wasn't always like this. It is the Gravemind and the Flood. The Flood can alter your brain so... It's so horrifying because they don't even have to corrupt you like they do. They can just leave a message, an idea in your mind that'll corrupt you so utterly and completely. The Didact always wanted to shield worlds because he didn't want to kill all life in the galaxy. He wanted shield worlds and to make Prometheans so that way the Prometheans could combat the Flood and they could still have people alive. Sure, he didn't really give a damn about humans, but still. However, the Flood also doesn't want the rings activated. Except, do they? Here's another thing we start to realize. Everything, even to this day, in some way, shape, or form, is the Flood, is the Precursor's will. Whether the rings get fired or not, the Flood endure. Because there were research stations on every ring, just as the Flood wanted. The Didact going mad, being put in a cryptum, just to be released in Halo 4, was that part of the plan? Because remember, Cortana also had an interaction with the Gravemind. She was stuck with the Gravemind for a while before you rescue her in Halo 3. And she was affected by it. Ultimately, the Domain also gave her this sort of delusion of power. So it also corrupted her. But by and large, the starting point to everything going wrong was the Gravemind touching her. That seems to be the ultimate thing. But was that the Gravemind's intent? Very possibly. Is it the precursor? Is every threat that humanity has faced since the Flood been ultimately a means for them? I mean, we have Zeta Halo, which we know has Flood facilities on it. But even still, if the Endless are precursors, something worse than the Flood, is that a part of their plan? The Flood endure. The vengeance that the precursors want never goes away. But it makes you think. This book does an expert, amazing, fantastic job of truly giving us the Didact's perspective. Because while his mind is being slightly twisted about the Gravemind, you also have this real things, because it kind of started to feel like, yeah, he's being corrupted by the Flood, and now he's becoming evil in the Great Bear trilogy. But think about it. He made this exact copy of himself with the Isodidact. The Isodidact and his wife are getting along fabulously. But the Flood, slight things in the mind that are messing with him. Jealousy starts to kick in. She loves this copy more than me. Did she even look for me? Did she even bother to try to save me while I was stuck in the burn? How can she love this copy? This isn't me. I'm who she fell in love with. And yet she goes with this fake me? How could she betray me like this? You see how these gears turn, and you just makes him double down on these bad decisions. It's tragic. But lastly, through all of this stuff, all these memories, all these events, the Didact in this afterlife is playing his literal hell at first, till he learns some things and atones for things. The Didact we meet at the end of this book is more like the didact that the librarian fell in love with than the villain we meet in Halo 4. And ultimately we learn, and this, again, helps fix Halo Infinite, and by extension Halo 5. But the reason Cortana in Halo Infinite made such a quick snap change, it wasn't quick. She was constantly arguing with the didact, and by the end of it all, right before she has that last conversation with Aatrox, where she asks him, if you knew you were going to die, how would you live your life differently? And he says, I wouldn't change anything, which seems to give her her answer. But before that scene even happened, the didact had a conversation with her, which ultimately planted the seeds, made her doubt. Aatrox's conviction only made her more certain of the error she had caused, which again leads her to willingly sacrifice herself to kill herself, to allow the weapon to do that, so that the Chief could have a second chance. All ultimately thanks to the didact. It's quite beautiful. And how does it end? Well, the didact's back in the domain, and finally, after all this time, also, thanks to those other Kelly Gay books, as you read with Guilty Spark, the didact is reunited with the librarian, which is really nice. And that's how the story ends. I'm sure I glossed over a bit, but that is the gist. And I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. I loved how connected it was. I mean, of course it was. It's about the didact, so it's going to be connected to the Forerunner trilogy. But that is by and large the best thing that you could ever read in these stories. So it's by and large phenomenal. I know you could definitely tell as I was going through these reviews, I was definitely becoming tired. I was definitely becoming cynical. But it definitely ended with a high note. And I'm so happy I stuck through with it and finished it. I loved Halo Epitaph. And again, I know it's Halo Studios now, and now it's not 343, but I pray and beg. I understand that the games need to be good. But please don't ever deprive us of these books. Allow them to matter to the overall plot without being essential to understanding a plot. But don't make meaningless blither either. You know? Why am I going to spend my money on a book on a story that ultimately will never matter? It can matter. It can actually recontextualize, help you appreciate a story more without being necessary. Like, you don't need this to understand Halo Infinite or Halo 5. But by reading this, it can recontextualize some things, soften some things for you, make you appreciate some things more. And it's what an expanded universe should do. And tell a meaningful, emotional story with the didact. You don't need it to enjoy the games, but it will certainly change your perception of it if you do read it. That's what an EU should do. Okay? Don't make meaningless stories that don't connect to anything and ultimately don't matter. That's my piece. I'd say let's finish the fight, but we have. Hope you stick around for whatever else I have to discuss. I have a bunch of sci-fi I want to talk about, from Isaac Asimov to Hyperion, classic space opera, Conan the Barbarian, Sword and Sorcery, Clark Ashton Smith, Lee Brackett, all that stuff. Other things like Wheel of Time, Malazan. I got stuff for years and years to come. Star Trek. If any of that interests you, I hope you subscribe. As for Halo, well, until they release more books, this is it for me. So, till next time, have a good one.